Ireland's view on Europe and on defence. Ireland has been a member of the EU, not from the first group, let's say, but I think from the second, from 1973. So that's already quite some time. Of course, there have been other successive waves of enlargement, but that enlargement at the time was already important. And of course, we're preparing for further enlargements. But even more importantly, of course, this is an extremely important week in the Brussels agenda, in the Western Alliance agenda. You know, today there is the meeting of the NATO in The Hague, and tomorrow and after tomorrow we have the European Council meeting here in Brussels, which will be discussing a lot of foreign policy issues, security issues, but also, I mean, Europe's neighbourhood issues, but also, as they usually do, also economic issues. And also we know, let's say, that Ireland is already on the list of one of these presidencies we are coming, which will have the Danish presidency coming in soon, and then we'll have Cyprus and then Denmark. So this is already part of the European agenda of many of the things which are discussed in this town and where the presidency then takes a big role. And that's why we're very happy, let's say, that we have Thomas Byrne today with us to give us a bit of an insight in how Ireland looks at its European agenda from its perspective. Ireland, as I said, let's say a member state since quite some time, but also has been quite high on the European agenda in the sense that certain things had to be approved by referenda in Ireland, let's say some changes to the treaty. So European issues have been widely discussed in Ireland, and that's why I think also Europe will be looking forward to that presidency, because Ireland will be preparing this very well. We'll be discussing with Thomas some issues related to Ireland's position in Europe, but also European policy issues, but also defense issues, as they are discussed today. You know that, or for those who do not know, Ireland is not a member of NATO, like one or two other member states which are not a member of NATO. It's a neutral country, like Austria is also neutral, and therefore not today in the NATO summit in The Hague. But that's also an issue which is important today, as Europe is discussing much more defense-related issues. And then you say, yes, our treaty says defense is an issue for NATO. But what do we do then with member states which are not members of NATO? That is certainly an important thing to discuss. Also, since the EU is taking a bigger role in defense and now trying to borrow money to invest in defense or in defense industries, let's say, just to strengthen our defense capacities. And then, of course, there is the Irish presidency coming, an important event, I think, certainly for Ireland, but also important for Europe, because there will be important things to be discussed. We will discuss also for example, the multi-annual financial framework, another extremely important issue for Europe. Let's say that, or 7 years kind of agreement for the financing of the EU, which will have to be decided by the end of the Irish presidency, on which the proposals are expected in the middle of July. So that discussion can then start as well on something which Ireland can start. So very happy to have Minister Byrne here today with us. He's been a long-serving politician in Ireland, but before becoming Minister for Europe and Defence, he was Minister for Tourism and Sports and for Education. And before that, let's say, already active in politics in Ireland. So, Thomas, it's a pleasure to have you and to listen to you. Afterwards, we will have some questions from my side, and then I will open up to the audience. We should finish by about 10 o'clock, but there will certainly be ample time for questions, so prepare yourself, please. Minister.
Thank you very much, Carol, and good morning, everybody. I see my colleague, Cynthia, I'm sure some other political representatives as well here this morning. I want to thank you, Carol, for hosting the discussion. Tomorrow, of course, I accompany the Irish Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, Micheál Martin, to the European Council. And of course, security and defence is top of the agenda there. So it's really, really good to offer the Irish perspective here today on how we can best secure not only Ireland, of course, but our European Union. I'm conscious, of course, that while we're here in Brussels this morning, all eyes are on The Hague, where members of NATO meet for their summit. Ireland is not amongst those gathered at The Hague, as Carol has said. We don't see a home for ourselves in NATO but we also understand that we cannot live in a house of splendid isolation. And the question of how best to secure our union is a question that confronts everyone in every single member state. So when I'm confronted with a question on security and defence, particularly from an Irish perspective, I do like to go back to first principles. So when navigating the question of how not just defence but also enlargement of Europe should be approached from an Irish perspective, I want to take a moment to go back to the fundamentals of the Irish state. Under the Irish Constitution, Article 29 sets out that our international relations policy is founded upon international justice and morality. And Ireland is committed under our Constitution to the ideal of peace and friendly cooperation among nations. And Ireland will always act in accordance with our obligations under international law. And our constitutional position is also clear when it comes to an EU common defence. Article 29 sets out that Ireland is prohibited from adopting a decision taken by the European Council if the European Council were to adopt such a decision under Article 42 of the treaty to establish a common defence that would include us. So we can't do that under our constitution. There are no proposals to do that. So our policy of military neutrality really means that Ireland does not participate in military alliances of defence arrangements, and that remains unchanged. But I am also deeply conscious that any bad actor will not hit our strengths, they will hit our vulnerabilities. And Ireland cannot be locked into a state of stasis in responding to geopolitical challenges and security and defence risks that face us and face us all. So for those reasons, my position is always to advocate for a policy of principles-based pragmatism in how Ireland approaches security and defence. So we go back to the principles of our constitution and our membership of the European Union and be pragmatic about it too. In putting forward this policy, I believe that we must be pragmatic about the threats that face us today, be realistic about them, and pragmatic about how we can face those threats as well. And that sense of pragmatism, in my opinion, must be rooted, however, at all times in the constitutional and legal principles governing the Irish state. In real terms, I believe that Ireland should increase our cooperation with our fellow EU member states on security and defence. I strongly support the EU's efforts to make sure that we can be better equipped to act and to deal autonomously with immediate and future challenges and threats. We need to continue the pace of increased investment in our security and defence capabilities, both at EU level and at national level in Ireland. And we are ramping up our investment in security in Ireland. We're acting to close our capability gaps. That is what's happening, and we're trying to do that as quickly as possible. And I acknowledge in Ireland we are coming from a low base, but things are moving. And in undertaking these actions, we're doing so in a manner that remains fully consistent with our legal principles and our moral values as a nation. Regarding NATO, Ireland has taken actually a principles-based pragmatic approach to our security and defence because we have had partnership with NATO since 1999, and that has been very successful. Our membership of Partnership for Peace has acted to improve the interoperability of our defence forces, including through our participation in UN and EU missions overseas. And I think that Ireland should grow this partnership in line with existing principles and through our individually tailored partnership programme. And it's easy to forget that it was actually quite controversial for Ireland to join Partnership for Peace, but I haven't heard it spoken too often in a negative context in Ireland in recent years. The White Paper on European Defence makes clear that Europe needs to invest more together to protect itself. The timing for such action could not be more pressing and the need could not be more acute. Not only is terrible conflict taking place in Europe as we speak, but the fear of such conflict broadening to other parts of the continent is very real. Earlier this month, I paid a sobering visit to the largest underground shelter in Helsinki, and I was reminded of the threat felt by so many of our EU citizens, particularly those who share a land border with Russia. So I fully appreciate that the fear in Europe is not imagined. It's based on a considered analysis of existing threats by our European partners. At home, the Irish government is advancing a range of actions to ensure the security of our country, to protect ourselves. As someone said to me, it's one of the main markers of being an independent country, that the Irish Defence Forces are protecting you, not the British Defence Forces, and we should be proud of that. And that, I say that as a challenge to some of those back home of a Republican nationalist perspective who also take a kind of a, I would say in general, an anti-military perspective as well. But we must enhance Ireland's resilience to hybrid threats, and we must meet the challenges of the future. The defence budget has seen a 22% increase since 2022. So this does represent significant progress on the government's commitment to increase our defence budget by a significant amount by 2028. We want to bring it up to 1.5 billion in 2022 prices by 2028, and that's part of the annual budgetary process. Our key focus in Ireland is on identifying those capability gaps and acting to close them. And part of the problem in Ireland is that we simply don't have some of the basic requirements. And we're really starting from a very low base, and I'm absolutely here to acknowledge that and accept that. But we've known that. We got a commission on the Defence Forces to examine this, to see what we need, what layers we need, what foundations we need to build a suitable defence forces. So just this month, the government signed a multi-euro contract with Thales DMS France for the provision of towed sonar capability. This investment significantly enhances our maritime security, and it will enable our naval service to better assess the threats in our maritime domain and contribute to the protection of our critical underwater infrastructure. The government is fully committed to increasing defence spending to meet what we call the higher levels of ambition set out in the Commission for Defence Forces, which we commissioned. But our view is that an increase in defence expenditure shouldn't simply become a target-driven process within the EU. But we also know that no state acting alone can address the entirety of existing and emerging security challenges. If I may move to enlargement, I believe that enlargement is the strongest policy tool that we have at our disposal in the EU to consolidate peace. Obviously, the EU's greatest peace project, to consolidate security as well. I think enlargement is the answer to a security problem that we may have as well, and prosperity right across our continent. I regularly engage with the governments of many of the candidate countries. Indeed, I think the Prime Minister of Montenegro is in Dublin today, for example. And I look forward to I will be visiting capital cities in the coming months as well. I visited Ukraine in April, and I underlined Ireland's strong support for its EU membership as it continues to battle against Russia's barbarism. At the start of the process, for the start of the clamour, I suppose, for Ukraine to become a candidate country back in 2022, Ireland was the first country on the western side of the European Union to support that. And indeed, one of my interlocutors in Ukraine said that we were the unusual suspect, that we weren't part of the Eastern European region that was supporting it at that particular time. I'm glad that we showed leadership on that too, because supporting Ukraine is not just a moral thing to do, it's not just a just thing to do, it's a matter of security, because Ukraine's security is Europe's security too. And we've always been a long-standing supporter of EU enlargement. Our support is rooted in the fact that we benefited from the first enlargement in 1973, and the last 50 years, and it's just over 50 years, of EU membership has transformed our economy and society. It has amplified our global influence and established, in my opinion, our sovereignty as a nation. Ireland believes that every European country deserves the same opportunity, provided, of course, they meet the relevant criteria. We can't pull up the ladder. We must help people get up the ladder. And we recognise, of course, that enlargement is in our security interests too. To fail to enlarge, in my opinion, would be to sow the seeds of our undoing. And the current momentum on enlargement is welcome, but it comes after a regrettable period of stagnation, a period when we failed to deliver on promises long since made. And we do see signs of enlargement fatigue in certain countries, and it becomes a political issue in those countries too, which is not good for them too. It increases instability. And it's weaponised. That fatigue is weaponised. Candidate countries can become a source of instability, but most of them are really reliable partners. Whether it's in terms of their high rates of CFSP alignment or their active participation in CSDP missions abroad, we have seen close and productive cooperation in multilateral forums. As the EU looks to recalibrate towards a more fractured geopolitical landscape, we find these ready partners on our doorstep. We should keep the door open. In our increasingly multipolar world, we need to understand the costs that will come with close alignment to the EU for candidate countries, and we need to help them offset those costs. And we need to take the people in candidate countries along with us too. Candidate countries need to feel the benefits of the EU even ahead of their accession, and to know that we're committed to their well-being and security. And when I was in Ukraine last month, Olga Stefanishyna, the Deputy Prime Minister, said to me that please recognise the effort that is going in here in Ukraine to work through the accession process while also fighting a war. She said it's real effort. In looking ahead to the near future, of course, the 1st of July will mark the start of the Danish presidency. We wish the Danish government every success, but it marks the 12-month countdown to Ireland's presidency of the Council of the European Union also. I will lead Ireland's EU presidency efforts here in Brussels, of course, but also at home in Ireland and elsewhere. It will be the Minister for European Affairs' responsibility to chair the General Affairs Council. And in a turbulent and unpredictable global environment, it would be unwise of me to predict what the landscape might be next year when we take on the presidency. But I think that securing Europe and enlargement will be at the core of our approach. And the approach of principles-based pragmatism on security and defence will act as a guide to security and defence, but it will also act as a guide to all the other issues that we face as well. I look forward to answering some of the questions. Thank you.
There are some people following in line as well, so I have to use the microphone, let's say that everybody can hear. Thank you, Minister. Interesting view on Ireland, and also having this specific focus from an Irish perspective on many of the European issues, because sometimes we forget that Europe isn't made in Brussels, but it's made in many of its member states, and you have many of the different focuses. But first of all, on security and on your role, I mean, if you hear speaking, of course, it's been debated also in the media that Ireland is a big country with a huge coast, and of course has these challenges, let's say, to defend its coastline. And you mentioned, let's say, this contract which you've concluded with Thales. But in the end, let's say, if you're starting to take a position for Europe's defense, can you maintain neutrality? So meaning, yeah, what does neutrality mean? I mean, it will be, you will be also, if you were speaking from neighbourhood, for example, issues, defending Europe.
Well, I think for us, and for me, certainly neutrality is really characterised by non-membership of military alliances. So non-membership in NATO, which is something that's just not on our agenda. It's not constitutionally prohibited for us to join NATO, but I think from a practical political point of view, it's not going to happen, and we've been careful to say that it won't happen. Any potential European common defence that would maybe establish a la NATO would be prohibited under our constitution, and that was brought in during the Lisbon Treaty referendums. We can't do that we can't join a European common defence without a referendum. So that is a block. But essentially, that's what our military neutrality is characterised by. I mean, we haven't been neutral in the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, simply because, as I say, we go back to our principles. What are our principles? Our principles are based on the UN Charter, the inviolability of the sovereign territory of nation states. So that was a very easy decision for us to take. Like if you were looking at a traditional policy of neutrality, or maybe a theoretical policy of neutrality, we'd say neutral, and we wouldn't take a side on that. But we did take a side. And we've given significant support to Ukraine. We've advocated at the UN, of course, the EU, but also significant financial support as well. So I think it's best to describe our neutrality in terms of our non-membership of military alliances. But that doesn't mean that we don't accept that we have to defend ourselves and that we have to be part of the European security architecture. Yeah. And our seas are very much part of the architecture of the European Union.
So which is, for example, different. Take another country, Switzerland. Its neutrality is a totally different neutrality than the neutrality as you define it. Meaning, you take a position much more strongly than Switzerland does, for example, on many of these international issues. Like on Ukraine, of course, Switzerland has joined with the EU, but it's certainly not as potent as Ireland.
Yeah, I spoke a number of years ago, before Finland and Sweden joined NATO. I spoke at a panel discussion at the Alpac Forum on neutrality, and representatives there of different countries who were neutral. And each one of us had a different perspective. Each one of us had a different view as to why we're neutral. I mean, Austria has its own particular reasons, Cyprus similarly, Malta. Finland and Sweden had certainly variations of neutrality before they joined NATO, highly militarised. I mean, I think in Ireland sometimes the word neutral or neutrality becomes associated with really anti-militarism or anti-military or anti-investment in the military. And that's not the government's perspective. It's not my perspective. It certainly wasn't Sweden and Finland's perspective before they joined NATO.
But then, for example, what the EU is doing now, let's say, to set up this Rearm Europe program to borrow money on the markets to invest in defense, is this not then posing a problem for Ireland to participate in this?
Well, first of all, it posed no problem for us to support it and to facilitate it happening. So I think maybe at the start of this process, perhaps people were wondering what Ireland's view would be, and would we facilitate this, or would we have a problem with the whole idea in principle? And we don't. And I think that we did, let this go forward and constructively took part in it in terms of the coming together and making decisions at the European Council and the various councils on it. So we're very constructive, I would say. And we may well join some of the measures as well. We haven't made decisions on it. We're not we're not borrowing at the moment, so that's not an issue for us at the moment. We may look at some projects under SAFE at some point. That's under consideration at the moment. So we may well take part in some of these things. We see our own defence as a national competence and national responsibility that we're trying to take more seriously than I would say previous governments did. And that may well involve and will involve cooperation with European countries.
And then to bring it in an institutional context, would you then have a strong position, for example, against abolishing unanimity for decisions on defense, because decisions on security, because of that reason?
I think we've achieved a lot with unanimity already. So I think sometimes when I hear this, should we abolish unanimity, should we abolish what we would call a national veto, it hasn't really, look, it has arisen, of course, in certain contexts. Yeah. We know that in the last couple of years, and we're very critical of it. But we feel we've achieved a lot with unanimity. I think unanimity on common foreign policy, security policy, I think is very, very important, because there are countries there with, with different perspectives, and we need to try to bring everyone together. But Ireland has never used this in a threatening context or in a way to extract something. And I think we must think of it in that context and look at what we have achieved with unanimity. Look at what bringing us all together has achieved. It's not perfect, but a lot has been done.
No, that's correct, let's say, because most decisions in this town are anyway taken mostly by consensus. And if there is, even on single market issues, there are sometimes things which are taken where some member states abstain or somebody votes against. But it's rather the exception. It's a big exception rather than the rule.
No, I do see some issues with the use of unanimity at on the enlargement process. I think there's too many opportunities to obstruct the process there with unanimity, and we would definitely like to see that changed.
And there you would change it for enlargement. I mean, which is treaty, which basically the IGC to start an enlargement, but not for the CFSP.
We could look at it in terms of the processes for enlargement. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's still going to be unanimity at the end of the day. Yeah, yeah. But at the moment, in terms of moving the process along, the use of the veto, I think, is really, really destructive to the countries affected. You can always have a decision. You can always say at some point we're blocking it. That's the rule. But this thing of just holding things up simply for political reasons on other files or bilateral issues, I think, is a waste of time.
And by which we are in the whole, whatever, the phases or the accession process, which is basically a very complex process, because there are something like 100 IGC-based decisions on an enlargement, which may come up during the, let's hope, during the Irish presidency, if something will be ready for that time.
Well, I certainly hope that we will be able to move some files along. I mean, look, the Montenegrin Prime Minister is in Dublin this week. That's a file we hope that will be progressed. Albania, I think, doing a lot of good work. I hope to go there soon. You mentioned Iceland as well. Let's see what happens in terms of maybe starting a process with Iceland at some point, but I certainly would love to be in a position to do that. But there are many others, Ukraine and Moldova, of course, as well, and North Macedonia and other countries too. And we take it very seriously, because I think it's good for them, it's good for us, it's good from an economic point of view, but I think it is also essential from a security point of view as well.
Yeah. But do you think, let's say, we should change this process, that this can move faster? Let's say that we don't have all these different IGCs, or
that we don't have unanimity kind of being a block at every step of the way is what I have an issue with. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and that has been a problem, and it is a problem at the moment when you look at, for example, what's happening with Ukraine and Moldova's process, where Hungary is blocking the opening of chapters, and I think that is wrong. They can always make a decision at some point. We don't want them joining. That's in the treaties. That's not something I can change, even though I don't think it's desirable to do it for the wrong reasons. But this thing of being able to block procedurally each step of the way, I think is just totally wrong.
But do you think there is a debate on this? I personally don't see too much happening here. It's more among specialists.
There have been some discussions among a number of governments on this, but I mean, look, I don't underestimate the difficulties of changing that,
Because it's extremely important, as you were saying, let's say that we really make a step forward, because we haven't done anything the last 5 to 10 years. The last enlargement was 2013.
The problem is you're creating a security risk for the EU, because when you build up the hope and then you don't deliver on that hope, it's a problem, because the people get annoyed with you, the citizens in those countries. Eventually, political actors, of course, are going to take advantage of that. I saw that myself in North Macedonia a couple of years ago when I was there. very, very tense political situation, which is driven by the process for EU enlargement, which again has been to some extent driven by bilateral issues with other member states.
Exactly. And as you were saying, you were in Ukraine, I think for that country, we have made that commitment and we have to really advance on that promise because it's so important, let's say, that we deliver. Otherwise, we will, risk an enormous loss of faith in the EU and loss of face of this EU Commission.
And I think it's so important to secure the future of Ukraine in the EU in order to secure all of our collective futures as well. I think it's really, really important at this point that their future is seen by them to be secure within the EU. And I think that that is important for us.
And you felt, let's say, if you're were there in Ukraine, that there is a belief, let's say, do they, because sometimes if you follow the media and about Ukraine, what's going on, you would become desperate, huh?
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult situation. And things, of course, have changed there in terms of, the American position has changed, and that is a significant issue. It is extraordinary to see the US voting in a particular way at the UN, at the General Assembly, and indeed the Security Council too. That is a problem. But what I do see from Ukraine and from Ukrainians is a genuine desire to be part of the Western European, as the European family, I call it Western Europe, but the traditional kind of perspective that we have in the Western Hemisphere. That's where they want to be. And I also saw immense gratitude. I was almost embarrassed at the gratitude that was shown to Ireland and to the European Union for what we've done for Ukraine, but they're doing it themselves. But I really, really do believe it's an urgent matter of our collective security that they become members of the European Union, and that path, at the very least at the moment, that the path is made clear for them, and that they can see the way to do it, and that the effort that the Deputy Prime Minister spoke to me about is something that will be rewarded.
Exactly, a very important thing, let's say, that we deliver on that and that we make progress. And of course, this whole process of enlargement plays an important role that we can advance. And of course, we know there are one or two countries who may try to benefit from the fact that they know they can block it and they can prevent the process.
Like I would say that when Ireland joined the EU in 1973, okay, we signed the treaty here in Brussels in, I think it was January 1972. And if you look up your history books, there were pretty devastating things happening on the island of Ireland in January 1972, and yet we managed over time to resolve differences with the UK around that European table, essentially. And that's a point I make to countries who have bilateral issues with other EU member states at the moment. Just look to our history, look when we joined, and yes, it took time, but yes, those issues were solved. I won't talk about Brexit, which was a bit of a rupture in that, but we are in a much different place, I would say, partly and substantially because of our shared membership of the European Union.
Indeed, let's say, sometimes forgotten, let's say, that afterwards people think, let's say, but there are border conflicts, let's say, for example, prospective member state, take, for example, Northern Macedonia, Bulgaria has this issue, but also Kosovo is still an issue. But then if you look backwards, there are quite a number of countries who had border conflicts before, which were resolved, as you were saying, by the EU.
In fact, I was talking to, during the Brexit, when I was Minister for Europe before, I was Minister for Sport as well, and the Slovenian and Croatians were telling me that they had only just resolved all border issues
True.
a few years ago.
Croatia and...
Croatia and Slovenia, that there were still issues outstanding, years after they joined the EU and years after the breakup of Yugoslavia. But they solved them on a bilateral basis by just continuing to work together.
Yeah, very important. Another thing which will come up for your presidency, which is probably a more technical issue, the multi-annual financial framework, which is kind of this annual 7 years financing program for the EU, which is a big thing for all the member states because it has to do with how much they contribute, how much they get back from the EU. How do you look at this from Ireland? What will be your priorities? I mean, of course, as I said, it will be proposed in July. But what is in it for Ireland?
Well, Ireland is now the single biggest per capita contributor. I think we're the 9th biggest overall. So we are a significant player, and we want to be a significant player, and we're quite content in being a contributor, and we're not going to turn into a frugal country. And as I say, we're not going to pull the ladder up at this particular point. But we do want to make sure that the budget can deliver for citizens. There's a lot of work going to happen once the Commission publishes its proposal. There will also be a meeting at the GAC, I think, in July as well, where we will, I suppose, have initial discussions. I'm going to meet the Commissioner today, Commissioner Serafin today, to set out the Irish position. The government adopted a national position this week at the government. I'll be briefing our MEPs on some of that this afternoon, and I will be presenting our national position to the Commissioner. So there's a lot of early discussions going on at the moment, and I suppose it'll be very important for Ireland to set out our national position at an early point, because, of course, during our presidency, I think that will come at a really, really important point in the negotiations, and it may well be left to us to finalise negotiations, or at least send them up to the leaders. So we look forward to that work during our presidency. But look, we want to see a budget that delivers. We're not going to pull the ladder up. But for Ireland, the Common Agricultural Policy is very, very important, and it will continue to be important. Horizon funding is very, very important. We see huge scope for increased investment in security and defence as well. And we want to see competitiveness funding that would benefit countries right across the European Union.
So you would be almost in favor, if I hear you speaking, for an enlarged budget, because if you want to have these 3 or these 4 big elements in there, and if you want to have much more for research and development, we'll need to have a bigger budget.
Well, that is the question. I think we'll have to discuss that over the next year or two. Look, we're not going to start the ball rolling by saying, well, we're already the highest contributor and we're going to go even higher. So that's not my opening position. But we need to deliver for citizens, and my government will have to be seen to deliver for Ireland too. And the Common Agricultural Policy, I mean, look, it is obviously a significant source of receipts in Ireland, but it is important from a food security point of view, and let's not forget that is why the policy was established. And exactly. It is important as well to make sure that we protect the fabric of rural life in the European Union too, and the Common Agricultural Policy helps to do that.
Where you see totally different approaches in many member states.
Yes.
Some member states have a very strong rural life, and others have a big problem.
Absolutely, and I think a strong rural life is something that we want to preserve in Ireland, because it is under threat. There's no question about that.
And you're from a rural constituency.
It's actually half rural, half suburban. Yeah, so it's an interesting constituency. Yeah.
And of course, in Ireland, you see this very, very well. Of course, we see it also when you export a lot to many other European countries, or say within the EU.
Absolutely, but we have to, again, it's a question of making sure that food is kept on the table, and we saw why this was established after World War II, after the experiences there. We saw the food price shocks after the invasion of Ukraine as well. That's now becoming an issue again, I think, in terms of food inflation around the place. So I think it is important to maintain our farmers on the land in rural areas.
Okay, I look at the audience who wants to raise a question. Yes, if you introduce yourself and have a question very clearly, I can take eventually 2 or 3 questions at once, but we start with you, please.
Hi, my name is Audrey Williams, and I work at the European Institute of Peace. Ireland is a board member. Can I ask, what role do you see for dialogue and mediation within the toolbox that Europe has at its disposal to advance its own peace and security and defense?
Sorry, the tool?
So basically, what is the role for dialogue and mediation within Europe's toolbox?
Interesting question. Is there another question at the moment, or otherwise? Yes, next to you.
It's handy and beside her. Hi, I'm Rosa. I'm a trainee at the Committee of the Regions. And I was going to ask about, there seems to be a certain amount of Euroscepticism emerging in Ireland regarding EU efforts for defence integration. And I was wondering if you consider Ireland's upcoming presidency as a means of countering that and creating this dialogue within Ireland, or maybe reconciling Ireland's traditional identity of military neutrality with European defence policy, or do you see more challenges emerging from that and more of a gap emerging?
2 very interesting questions, yes.
Well, of course, as an Irish minister, I'll always say that dialogue and mediation are part of our toolbox, because, we have the example of the Northern Ireland peace process, which was very much a success of dialogue and mediation. And that mediation was international as well. So the talks were chaired by George Mitchell. There were significant involvement from the European Union, Ahtisaari and Holkeri from Finland, people like that, all over the world were involved. And it is a huge success of Irish, British, European and American policy. American and European foreign policy for those countries, Irish and British domestic policy as well. So that's really important. So that is very much part of our toolbox. Look, Ireland, one of my party predecessors, Frank Aiken, was really the driving force behind the Non-Proliferation Treaty as well. So this is very much in Ireland's DNA and in my party's DNA as well, that we look towards dialogue and mediation. And that's why we place huge value in multilateralism and multilateral institutions, primarily the EU. And I think that is working well, because if there are issues between member states, which not too many issues between member states, if we're honest about it, you can talk to people. And again, it's one of the difficulties actually since Brexit, because our office was in the council building, was next door to the British office in the council building. So any issues that arose around Northern Ireland could be discussed in the corridors. That was a huge problem, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit referendum and Brexit itself, the Boris Johnson government, and COVID, when contacts between the governments were really, really very minimal. That has changed, I think, since this government has come in, and we're really trying to re-establish the dialogue and mediation, such as, for example, the EU-UK summit, and indeed the British-Irish summit as well, and we've had some really good outworkings from that will continue. So yeah, we see that that is really, really important. And I suppose in terms of our contribution to world peace and security over the last decades, I mean, every day that we've been a member, every day that there have been UN peacekeepers, we've been there as UN peacekeepers, and that's something that we're very, very proud of. Just, you asked Rosanna a question on countering Euroscepticism. Look, Ireland has probably the highest level of support for membership of the EU among any member states, so we're very supportive of it. But I think there is a challenge to bring people along on security and defence issues, and that's why I'm trying to frame it in terms of the first principles. Well, we're talking about our constitution. Well, let's read the constitution. What's in the constitution? The constitution is very clear. It's about morality is actually mentioned in the context of international law. Justice, peace, friendly relations among the nations is mentioned, and not joining a European common defence, and that was put in because of the Lisbon Treaty referendum at the time to get that over the line. But they're the basic principles that we stick to, and I think if we stick to them, I think we can bring the public along with the need. It's not simply in our case to raise a target as they're talking about at NATO, but simply in our case to get the very basics of a national defence infrastructure in that any independent country needs to have, and then to build on that, to build on those layers that we establish.
Thank you. Yeah, I see a question at the back and here in front, or two questions at the back.
Hi, my name is Dermot Hayes. I work for a health non-profit in Brussels. You spoke there about the different definitions of neutrality, and Ireland's kind of history is more of an anti-militarist or almost an anti-imperialist characteristic that isn't necessarily shared by the government. I'm just worried about this pragmatic based principles and where the pragmatism comes and affects the principles. You've acknowledged in the Lisbon referendum that that the ban on joining a EU defence was brought in, but also in the referendum debates was the triple lock, and that was said by your leader at the time that it was a core part of Irish neutrality. So if that is also being rolled back on now, like when does pragmatism overrun the principle?
I might respond to that because it's a big question in itself on the triple lock. Look, when I talk about the principles, they're in the Constitution, and we can't change the Constitution without a referendum, so that's not changing. So those principles, in terms of not joining an EU common defence, are there in the Constitution, if there were to be a proposal to have an EU common defence, that is. And the other points that I mentioned as well. On the triple lock, and I mentioned this actually before we spoke, the triple lock at the moment requires that if Ireland is going to send military abroad, primarily for peacekeeping purposes, we have to get, obviously, government approval, approval of Parliament, and a UN Security Council mandate. So that's called the triple lock. Now, what we've seen in recent years is that the UN Security Council is not working in the way that it should, particularly, of course, since one of the permanent members of the Security Council has invaded one of our neighbours, one of our candidate countries, Ukraine. And at the moment, if we want to send troops abroad on peacekeeping missions, or indeed if we want to renew the mandates of existing missions, we have to go to the Security Council and to get that support. And that support is not always clear. So we recently had a decision on Irini, which is an operation there in terms of the arms embargo on Libya, where Irish and many other EU member states troops take part. That was renewed for 6 months. We see as well talk, and again, this has been in the media, about UNIFIL, which is, Ireland is famous, I suppose, for being involved in UNIFIL in Lebanon over many, many decades, and Irish soldiers have served incredible distinction there, and indeed some have lost their lives there as well, and acknowledge that. It's not clear that the UNIFIL mandate will be renewed at the Security Council. Now, the difficulty for Ireland is, the day that mandate expires, our troops have to leave on that day, under Irish law. Now, logistically, it's almost impossible, but it will have to happen legally. But what will happen in practice is that the Lebanese, it's again, I can't speak for the Lebanese government, but if you took a similar hypothetical situation, the government in the area where the troops are could invite them to stay to maintain peace under particular provisions of national law and other international law as well. Irish troops could not take part in that unless it was Security Council mandate. So we would be going home, and the mission, the peacekeeping mission, would be remaining among other member states. And there are other examples of this. Like I was at the UN when we were on the Security Council. We have the annual renewal of Althea, which is again in Bosnia, and it wasn't clear to the last possible moment as to whether Russia would veto this or not. And I just don't think that's appropriate for our foreign policy at the moment, that we have to go to the Security Council to see will Russia, will China veto what we're going to do. Indeed, will the US veto what we would propose to do. There have been no new peacekeeping missions mandated by the Security Council since 2014, I think. So they're not happening at the moment. So we think that this is just not working at the moment. And again, we want to be pragmatic about it, that we have national authorization for this, like almost every other country. I'm not sure that there is any other country in the world that requires this. And yes, it was brought in at the time of the Nice and the Lisbon referendums. But I personally don't think it's acceptable that Russia decides what Irish troops, where they will go. And that is the reality of it at the moment. And they're not the answer, yeah.
So is there a red line then, or is there a line that you wouldn't cross if that's already been crossed, or is it just non-membership of NATO? Where does the principle, what's the principle?
Well, we're guided by peace and friendship among the nations and justice and morality in our international relations with other states. So what we abide by is the UN Charter, by the European Convention on Human Rights. These are bedrocks of what we do. In fact, the ECHR is bedrocked into the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement. These things, and it's part of our law too. So these are really, really important for us, and these are the principles that are legally written down, and in some cases legally part of our constitution. The government simply cannot go against. But the triple lock is a matter of national legislation, national policy, and I personally think its time is gone. And that does not mean we don't operate in accordance with the UN Charter. We have to operate in accordance with international law. That is an absolute bedrock principle for us, and we've shown that time and time again.
Yeah, very important issue, but we have to move on. Let's say your neighbour has a question, and then this person here in front.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Owen. I'm from the Martin Centre DPP think tank. I want to thank the Minister for taking the time this morning. The Minister was very clear in saying that Ireland isn't neutral on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think his exact words are, we did take a side, and Ukraine's security is Europe's security. But I'm a bit disturbed that the Irish don't seem to see that this, is this a credible policy while we are supporting Ukraine but offering no useful military assistance? And I would just, ask one question and offer two clarifications. My question is, for all this talk of principles and morality, which can make the Irish seem very, very detached from the actual debates here in Brussels, and certainly from the actual debates we're having in places like Warsaw and Tallinn and Riga. My question is this really a credible policy? And what will the Irish do if Russian missiles start to hit Warsaw or Tallinn or some of our fellow EU members? Will we just say, we support you, but we're not going to do anything useful? So that's my question. And my two clarifications are, the Minister made a big deal about how our defence spending is going to increase to 1.5 billion by 2028. Ireland is a 500 billion plus economy. That implies that our relative military spending will still remain at 0.3, 0.4 of GDP. And the second clarification is relation to the recent investments in the defence forces. Towed sonar is very nice, but you have to have the ships and the personnel to utilise that equipment. And my friends in the defence forces tell me that there are many days when there is not one serviceable ship available to patrol 16% of the EU's coastal waters. Thank you.
Yeah, just thanks very much. Thanks very much for those questions. I mean, look, it's just incorrect to state that we haven't given support to Ukraine. Under the European Peace Facility, we were committed to about 250 million in non-lethal military support to Ukraine. And that whole non-lethal thing came from the last government when the Greens were part of it. But that has been, that type of support that was committed to Ukraine there, and accepting the issues with the EPF, has been very much appreciated by the Ukrainians. And because the EPF is not working, we've committed bilaterally to allocate €100 million just in March gone by to provide, again, non-lethal military support. That's done and given to Ukraine through partnerships with other EU member states who are already procuring, for example, on demining. And there was a whole thing about demining in the Irish Dáil, where some of the far left opposition were complaining about us supporting significantly demining in Ukraine. And the clip went viral of the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister at the time, just standing there in utter disbelief that somebody would have an objection to that. But that is some of the objections we do have in the Irish Parliament. And that was an objection to spending some of this significant money in Ukraine. And we've given them very, very significant support. We're also either the second or third highest receiver of Ukrainian refugees in the European Union as well. 2% of the Irish population today is a Ukrainian refugee. So we've taken a lot of people, not quite as many probably as Poland, maybe one other country, but more than anybody else. So I'm very, very proud of the support that we give to Ukraine, and we have certainly pushed the boat out in terms of what we would do. And it's non-lethal military equipment, so it's not raw ammunition, but there's a lot of other things that the Ukrainian military needs and that the Irish government has been able to help and to provide with other member states. And I'm not here sitting looking for a reward or a prize for first place. We're not there. But I think the support that we're giving to Ukraine is absolutely unprecedented in our history in terms of military support to another country, and is an example of the evolution of Irish defence policy. And again, I acknowledge, on the second point, I acknowledged here at the stage that we're coming from a very low base, so I'm not going to counteract what you're saying there. But what I am saying is that if we want to have a defence forces capacity, defence forces capability that's modern and appropriate to our country, and again, you're right, appropriate to the sea around us. There was a very satirical song in the 1960s in Ireland called "The Sea Around Us," which satirised the Irish military. And I think that we are moving beyond that. But if we want to have the ships, to protect the Irish coast, we need to have the basics in place, and that is the sonar. If we want to have the planes, the fighter jets that modern militaries have, we need to have a proper radar system, which we don't have at the moment. So our approach is to procure the layers, the foundations, and to build on that from there. So our defence spending commitment, which is a 40% increase up to 2028, gets us those basic foundations, which I'm the first to acknowledge are not there. And then after that, there's a commitment following on from the Commission on the Defence Forces, as I said, to build on that and to make sure we have what you're talking about. So the challenge is twofold. One is, of course, what I've just said, in terms of we need to get the foundations and the layers in, but also procurement is a challenge as well. It's very, very difficult. If you were to give unlimited money to the Irish Defence Forces today, I don't think they'd be able to buy all the equipment, let alone use it, because we simply don't have the layers that are, the foundations that are necessary to use the types of equipment that we do badly need.
Indeed, you need to build the base and take some time. Let's say the person here in front, you were waiting already some time.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Alexandra Bryson. I work for the EU, but I'm here just in my capacity as an interested Irish citizen this morning. Thank you to SEPS, and also thank you to the Prem Rep for organising this, and thank you, Minister. My question has kind of been a little bit touched upon by others as well, but I'm just curious a little bit to hear more about Ireland's red lines when it comes to this new chapter of defence policy, what that means for us, what we can engage on, what we can't engage on. And then I also have another question that you mentioned about procurement. Of course, there are a limited amount of companies, and these companies, they're producing weapons that are being used against civilians in other places, which also is a little bit difficult for us. So I'm just curious, how do we reconcile this all together? Because, of course, as you said, Europe is in itself a peace project, but now we need to defend ourselves, which is very reasonable, very logic, but they are a little bit at odds with each other. So I'm just curious a little bit to learn more about what we can do, what we can't do, and where we stand completely. Thank you.
Well, first, and thanks for saying it. I mean, the European Union is a peace project. I mean, the Northern Ireland peace process was inspired really by peace between France and Germany. John Hume, the famous peacemaker, MEP, said he stood at the bridge of Strasbourg and said, well, if Germany and France can come together, in the European Parliament and in other institutions and other organisations, why can't Catholics and Protestants or Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland come together? And he was right. So that provides our bedrock, and indeed the EU has provided significant financial support to Northern Ireland even since Brexit, actually jointly with the UK, and that's really, really important. One of the only things we agreed on during the Boris Johnson government, apart from what we did at the end, was actually financial support to Northern Ireland jointly with the EU, and that was really, really important. So that said, so we are a peace project, but also we're a successful economy, and we have to secure that economy as well. And like war, invasion, hybrid threats, cyber threats are a serious problem to potential problems to our economies. So we've got to protect them as well. And again, I spoke about what we need to do from, I suppose, a hard military point of view in Ireland, but there's a lot to do on the cyber side as well. We had a very significant attack from a cyber point of view on our health service a number of years ago, and that had resulted in huge problems for our health service. And again, I was on a debate on TV one night with a far left MP, and I said, well, look, are you for or against securing our health service? And spending on cyber defences can actually protect our health service. Spending on soldiers' wages, recruiting more soldiers, is defence spending. And generally speaking, people aren't opposed to that. I think there's a lot we can do that we need to do that will result in making us more secure without getting even into the issues that you discuss. In terms of our red lines, I think our absolute red line is that if there were ever to be a proposal for European common defence, and again, I don't see that coming, we would be constitutionally prohibited from doing that. And also, as a matter of policy, membership in NATO is not going to happen. But I think there's huge scope for cooperation. We've been members of Partnership for Peace since 1999. And what that means is that we're working towards interoperability with NATO, that we can work on missions with other EU and NATO member states, and that we can have our military up to NATO standards as well. And I think that is huge for us and for our military working as an independent nation. Beyond that, I don't have a huge amount of red lines. We're not going to go to war against anyone because, again, another of our red lines is that we're bound by the UN Charter. So we're going to absolutely defend ourselves if we ever had to, and that's in the cyber domain or whatever other domain is relevant to us. But the principles of peace, and again, I don't say peace. I don't say peace as sometimes the word peace is misused. I'm simply using it because it's a word that's used in the Irish Constitution. And again, it's very important for us. But we want to make sure that peace can be maintained within the European Union. We work as hard as we can as a small country to try to help maintain it around the world too. But that does require securing ourselves as well.
Thank you. I have a time for one more question, yes, and then we'll have to stop this meeting. Yes.
Thank you today. So I'm Sunny, currently a graduate student from Taiwan. So my question is, on behalf of the defense sector becoming more significant recently, and given the fact that you just mentioned the huge budget on enlargement of a defense sector, so how does the Irish government or maybe other European countries seek the balance between utilizing budgets on defense sector and other industrial sectors, particularly on top of finance, as this issue can be a significant one in the case of Taiwan?
I just hope we get the meaning of the question correct. I mean, how do we balance defence spending against other spending, particularly other industrial spending, as you said? So, well, I think some of defence spending will be obviously connected to other industrial spending as well in terms of other purposes. When I talk about cyber, I think as well, I think there's huge scope in Ireland because we have a lot of experts in the whole area of IT and cyber that we can use for defending ourselves and defending our systems, but that also, of course, have other purposes as well. And I think that investment in our defence systems and in defence procurement can help other sectors too. One thing I am conscious about from an Irish point of view is that we have a very small defence sector in Ireland. Ireland is a country that has traditionally benefited from open trade, has benefited from being part of the European single market. We can sell our products, we can provide services outside the island because we're too small just to sort of look after ourselves. So we have to go out to the world. And that is going to be a challenge for us in the defence sphere. So with all this increase in defence spending, I am concerned to make sure that we are able to help Irish companies to become part of that system, to be able to expand their offerings to be able to get into European markets, and indeed in some cases to be able to supply ourselves. And again, that's not simply ammunition companies. Like again, there are lots of aspects of defence spending. There are companies in Ireland that work on drones, etc. And that is something I think that we have to develop in a more developed way, because at the moment we've a very small sector, but they need to be helped as well, because this money is going to be spent across Europe. I think it's very important from an Irish perspective that our companies, and indeed European companies in general, can benefit from that and be part of that, because that is part of our security as well, that we're able to do these things insofar as we can within the European Union.
Thank you, Minister. And that's where, for example, the EU's budget will be very important, the Horizon program, but also, for example, loans from the EIB, which now can do for the defence, let's say, just to support investments in the sector in Ireland. Let's say, in Ireland, amongst others. Let's say, you have a limited base at the moment. Very important to have that.
Yeah, and the EIB, we've had lots of engagement with them in the last number of years on various aspects of investment.
Exactly, and the EIB has changes, which is a very important development as well. So with this, thank you very much, Minister. It was very interesting to hear you, also to hear this thinking towards what's going on here in Brussels, to hear your thinking on enlargement. Very strong support, let's say, for what's going on in Ukraine, let's say, into the next enlargement towards these countries, and also, as you said, Montenegro, and who knows, let's say, another country from the Balkans. Also, thank you for your explanations on the whole security issues, which are very important, let's say, to help us understanding how you see Ireland's neutrality. And also these things, let's say, are certainly not sufficiently understood also in Brussels or in other European countries. But also, I mean, also your strong support for the EU and for what the EU is doing and what the EU has meant for Ireland. So with this, I would like to thank you, certainly, for taking the time to explain this to us. Certainly wish you a successful preparation for the presidency, and if we can be of any help, let's say, we can certainly do that. But also thanks to all of you, and thanks for all these different questions. So thank you very much, and lots of success.